Something happened in the last 24 hours that the world is about to misunderstand in the most expensive possible way. Iran said the Strait of Hormuz was open, oil fell hard, markets relaxed, television anchors used words like relief, breakthrough, de-escalation. The President of the United States posted thank you to Tehran as if the central drama of the war had just broken in Washington's favor. Then, before that relief had even settled, the strait closed again, gunboats returned, merchant vessels reversed course, a container ship took a hit, insurance panic, came rushing back. The same trading screens that had just priced in calm were suddenly pricing in exposure. Again, most people are going to call that confusion. I think that reading is wrong. I think Iran opened the strait to demonstrate that it could. I think it closed the strait again to demonstrate something much more important. Not simply that it can create pain. The world already knew that. It wanted to prove that the real power in Hormuz is not the power to shut it. The real power is the power to decide when it opens, for whom, under what conditions, and at what political price. That is a very different kind of struggle. If you think this war is about a simple binary open or closed, then the last day looks erratic, emotional, unstable, almost theatrical. But if you understand that the deeper fight is over the post-war rules of passage, then what happened looks measured, sequential, and almost institutional in design. That is the real question. Now, what is Iran actually trying to win? Because if you answer that correctly, the last 24 hours stop looking like chaos and start looking like a controlled demonstration performed in front of the entire global economy. Let me walk you through it carefully. When the war began on the 28th of February, the United States and Israel hit Iran with the kind of opening blow that was meant to do more than destroy targets. The purpose was political theater at strategic scale. The message was not only for Tehran, it was for every capital, every trading floor, every navy, every oil ministry, every state trying to decide whether American force still sits above every other force in the system. Washington wanted the region to see hierarchy. America could still strike first, strike hardest, and set the ceiling. Iran answered in the place where military power collides with economic reality. It answered in Hormuz at its narrowest point. The strait is roughly 34 kilometers wide. That is not much water for something that carries so much of the world. As economic blood through it, in ordinary times, around 20 million barrels of oil a day move through that passage. A major share of the world, as liquefied natural gas moves through it as well. Close that corridor long enough and you do not create a bad headline. You create a cascading systems problem. Storage fills, freight rates rise, insurance surges, exporters begin curtailing production because they have nowhere to send what they pump. Importers start scrambling for alternatives that do not exist in sufficient volume. Energy becomes more than a commodity. It becomes a political stress multiplier. Iran knew that from the beginning, but here is the part too many people still refuse to say plainly. Iran never used Hormuz like a simple on-off switch. It did not close the strait equally to everyone. It operated it selectively. Friendly or useful countries received movement. Others did not. China, Russia, India, Iraq, Pakistan, and then later others through tailored understandings were not treated the way Western countries were treated. Passage became conditional. Navigation became political. Transit started looking less like a universal right and more like a permission slip. That distinction changes everything. A closed strait is disruption. A selectively open strait is an institutional claim. One says, I can hurt you. The other says, I decide. That is the deeper war hidden inside the visible one for weeks. The United States approached the problem as if overwhelming pressure would eventually restore the old order. Strike enough launch sites, sink enough small boats, kill enough commanders, move enough ships into theater, expand the blockade, tighten financial pressure. Eventually, Tehran would lose the ability or the will to hold the waterway hostage, and the old understanding would return. Free passage would be restored. The world would breathe out. Washington would say force worked, but that is not how this has unfolded. Iran did not need to defeat the United States at sea in order to alter the architecture of the strait. It only needed to force the world to live, even temporarily, under a different operating reality. And that reality is already visible. Countries that wanted ships to move had to deal with Tehran. Shipping firms adapted to Tehran's decisions. Friendly countries accepted differential treatment instead of demanding universal treatment. Markets learned to price the strait, not as an abstract legal passage, but as a channel governed by conditional access. That is not nothing. That is precedent in motion. Now go back to what just happened. Iran opened the strait. The world responded instantly. Oil dropped more than 10% in one session. That alone tells you how much fear had been trapped inside the market. Public relief came fast because the system had been waiting for exactly the signal. Then, within 18 hours, the strait closed again. That reversal looked humiliating for Washington, only if you assume the point of the war was to compel a clean reopening under American terms. I do not think that was the only thing revealed. I think Iran was showing the world a sequence. First, I can open it. Second, when I open it, the entire world responds. Third, when I close it again, that response vanishes. Fourth, the value of this waterway is not merely strategic in wartime. It is political every hour of every day. And fifth, if you want stability here after the war, you are not negotiating only over missiles or uranium or sanctions. You are negotiating over authority. That is why this is bigger than a shipping crisis. Iran is trying to turn temporary wartime leverage into post-war institutional relevance, and if that sounds too abstract, let me make it concrete. Earlier in the conflict, ships from some countries moved under arrangements that were plainly not universal freedom of navigation. They moved because Tehran allowed movement. That means the legal theory written into international convention had already been displaced in practice by something more basic and more ancient. Power was being converted into administered passage. Even friendly states discovered what that meant. India, which had been treated as a friendly nation for shipping purposes, still learned that a pass can be revised, delayed, constrained, or revoked, because under this model, the holder of the pass is not the sovereign actor. The issuer is. That is why I think the best framework for understanding the story is not blockade, not deterrence, and not even leverage in the simple sense. It is the toll booth doctrine. Let me explain what I mean. The conventional story says, Iran closes Hormuz to inflict pain, America tries to force it open, one side eventually blinks, and the world goes back to something like normal. That story is too shallow. Iran is not primarily fighting for the right to close the strait. Iran is fighting for the permanent right to conditionally open it. Those are two very different objectives. If your goal is closure, then reopening the strait looks like retreat. If your goal is conditionality, then opening it under your own framework is the point. And once you see that, the last day reads differently. Iran was not backing down and then changing its mind. It was demonstrating who sits in the booth. The booth decides who moves. The booth decides when the lane is clear. The booth decides whether the pass still counts. The booth decides whether the fee is valid, whether the route is designated, whether the certificate is recognized. That is the claim, not always stated in those exact words, but increasingly visible in the language, the practice, and the adaptations of everyone around it. This is why the ceasefire language matters so much. One of the least appreciated details in the entire conflict is that the diplomatic architecture around the fighting has already started to smuggle institutional assumptions into temporary agreements. If you allow transit fees, route coordination, or security service language to enter ceasefire documents, then you are doing more than reducing violence, you are legalizing habits, and habits in strategic waterways become frameworks faster than people realize. That is what makes this so dangerous for Washington. The United States can still destroy targets, it can still tighten the blockade on Iranian ports, it can still apply pressure on enrichment, sanctions, relief, and force posture. But if while all of that is happening, the world quietly begins adapting to a model in which passage depends on arrangements with Tehran, then military superiority and strategic outcome begin to separate. America can dominate the battle space and still lose the post-war operating framework. That is the deeper risk. To understand how big that risk is, it helps to look backward. In 1956, when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France believed military success could reverse a political fact. They could invade, compel a reversal, and reimpose the old order. What they learned instead was that once a strategic waterway is politically redefined and enough actors begin adapting to the new reality, military success alone does not restore the old institutional world. The canal did not revert to the pre-crisis order. A new normal settled in. The world adjusted, the question closed. I am not saying Hormuz is identical to Suez. I am saying the structural logic rhymes. The deepest fight is not over a day of shipping. It is over the authority structure that survives the crisis. And that is why the last 24 hours matter so much. Iran did not only close the strait again, it tested the world's reflexes. How fast would markets move? How eagerly would Washington claim victory when the water briefly opened? How much relief was stored inside the system? How much fear returned the instant closure resumed? What did that teach everyone watching? It taught them that Hormuz is not merely a battlefield, it is a pricing mechanism attached to sovereignty claims. Now let me stillman the other side, because if you want to understand a structure clearly, you have to test the strongest version of the argument against it. The strongest American argument is straightforward. Iran is badly damaged, its economy is under severe strain, its ports are under pressure, its infrastructure has taken real hits, its military chain has been degraded, its supreme leader is gone, its nuclear file remains exposed, the blockade has forced ships to turn back, the diplomatic channel has boxed Tehran into a narrowing set of choices. Iran needs a deal more urgently than it admits, and the stop-start pattern in Hormuz is proof of weakness, not proof of control. That case is not foolish. Iran is under intense stress. The damage is real. The internal pressure is real. The enrichment dispute is real. And yes, the difference between a 5-year and 20-year nuclear moratorium is not a fake disagreement. It is an actual negotiating gulf. But that Steelman still misses something crucial. Iran does not need to win the war in any absolute sense in order to win the architecture. It only needs to establish the precedent before the war ends. And that may already be happening. If for weeks the world has already operated under selective passage, if countries have already sought movement through bilateral understandings rather than through universal principle, if fee language and route coordination language are already creeping into diplomatic texts, then the framework has already shifted from what it was before the war. Maybe not permanently yet, but not temporarily in the harmless sense either. The world has adapted. Adaptation matters because it hardens faster than official doctrine. Shipping companies reroute before ministries release papers. Markets price risk before lawyers settle theory. Governments accept practical passage before they resolve philosophical passage. By the time official institutions catch up, the real framework may already be living in practice. And that brings us to the legal layer, the one most coverage still treats as background when it is actually central. Under the established understanding of international maritime law, Hormuz is a strait used for international navigation. The logic of that regime is simple. You do not ask permission. You do not buy access. You do not receive certificates from one coastal state telling you the world. Energy arteries available today, passage is not supposed to depend on political favor. That was the law as written. It is not the law as lived since this war began. That gap between legal text and operational reality is where the future of Hormuz now sits. If no major institution forcefully restores the old understanding, then silence itself begins doing institutional work. The vacuum does not remain empty. It fills. First with practice, then with expectation, then with precedent. And once precedent forms in a waterway, this important reversing it becomes much harder than people think. Now bring China into the picture not as a talking point, but as a structural actor. China has enormous exposure to Hormuz. A huge portion of its energy supply depends directly or indirectly on that corridor. So the lazy story would be that China should have been the loudest defender of universal transit rights. But that is not what mattered most. What mattered most was movement. China needed ships to move and built flexibility around that need. If ships can move through arrangements with Tehran, then China's practical interest is served even if the formal legal order is being quietly replaced. That is why you have to watch commerce more than rhetoric. Diplomatic statements will tell you. Everybody wants normal passage. Commercial behavior tells you which framework they are actually willing to live under. If Chinese tankers move through arrangements blessed by Tehran, while Beijing publicly speaks the language of international stability, then the signal is obvious. China is willing to live with conditionality so long as the energy continues to flow. That matters because America brought maximum force to the region. China brought maximum flexibility. Iran is trying to convert force plus flexibility into administered authority, and Europe, which declined to fully enter the military side of the problem, when it still might have shaped the outcome, is now confronting the institutional consequences of that decision. That is why conferences in Paris or London matter less than what happens in the water itself. You can draft a beautiful multilateral framework on paper, but if ships keep moving under Iran as practical model while the paper framework remains unenforced, then the paper is not the operating system, the water is. That is the rule in crises like this. The map is not the territory, the memo is not the lane is the lane. And right now, the lane is being taught to the world as something Tehran can regulate. This is also why the next 72 hours matter so much. The ceasefire clock is not just a military deadline, it is an institutional deadline. Watch what the IRGC says when the ceasefire reaches its edge, not the emotional tone, the administrative tone. Do they talk like soldiers closing a battle zone, or do they talk like an authority managing passage? Those are radically different signals. If the language remains about fees, designated routes, traffic control, security services, transit approval, oversight, and management, then the toll booth doctrine survives whether bombs resume or not. Watch the ships, not the spokesman. Do Chinese vessels continue moving? And if they do, under what understanding? Do Indian vessels return under renewed bilateral arrangements? Or does New Delhi begin openly rejecting the framework it had implicitly lived with? Watch Pakistan's mediation architecture. If the real channels move beyond public foreign ministry language into security level shuttle diplomacy, then the ceasefire may be less fragile than it looks. If everything stays at the level of rhetoric, the gap is wider than public statements suggest, and watch Washington's target logic if the war resumes. If American strikes continue to focus primarily on vessels, launch sites, and physical threat nodes, then Washington is still fighting the visible war. If it begins striking the command and institutional apparatus of Hormuz enforcement, then Washington has realized that the real battle is over the administrative claim, not just the kinetic one. That does not mean America would automatically win that fight. It means it would at least be fighting at the correct level. Because this is not ultimately a story about whether Iran can sink ships for another week. It is a story about whether the world will quietly accept a future in which passage through the most important energy choke point on Earth is no longer governed by universal rule, but by managed access. That is the real prize, not a dramatic victory, not a flag planted over a naval base, not a parade, institutional relevance, enduring leverage after the bombs stop, a state that emerges from a war still able to say, you do not cross here without accounting for me, has secured something much more durable than a battlefield headline. That is what Iran is fighting for. Not simply revenge, not simply escalation, dominance, not even simply sanctions, relief, relevance, and the mechanism for that relevance is 34 kilometers of water. Once you see it that way, the last 24 hours become brutally clear. Iran opened the strait and the world rewarded the opening immediately. Iran closed it again and the world recoiled immediately. That means the value of the opening belongs to whoever can credibly claim the power to provide it. That is what the controlled demonstration was about. Not chaos, not indecision. A reminder, you want calm here, then you are going to have to decide whose authority produces calm. And that brings us to the hardest sentence in the whole story. The question is no longer whether Iran can close Hormuz. The question is whether the world is preparing to pay politically, legally, strategically, or literally to have it open. That is why this next phase is so dangerous. Because once the world begins negotiating the price of passage, instead of insisting on the principle of passage, the principle is already halfway gone. And if that principle goes in Hormuz, every state watching learns the same lesson. Strategic waterways are not only protected by law, they are protected by the willingness of powerful states to enforce the law before adaptive alternatives become normal. If that willingness fades, then practice rewrites doctrine. That is how orders change. Not always with declarations, often with accommodation, quiet at first, then routine, then permanent. So yes, the Strait of Hormuz closed again, but that is not the deepest story. The deeper story is that in one day, Iran may have shown the whole world a transition point between temporary disruption and post-war authority. And if that is what just happened, then what comes next is not just another chapter in a Middle East war. It is a referendum on who gets to write the operating rules for the arteries of the global economy. Push back on this if you see it differently, but start with the sequence, the opening, the relief, the gratitude, the reclosing, the reversal, the fear, the adaptation that is not noise, that is the structure speaking. And the structure is asking one brutal question. The world agreed for decades that no single state gets to charge a political price for moving through this water. Iran has spent weeks teaching the world a different reality. The question now is not whether that lesson was delivered. The question is whether the world is about to accept it.